The Doom of the Haunted Opera by Brad Strickland and John Bellairs, Chapter 9. The next few days were strange and unsettling. The eerie fog that cut off New Zebedee from the rest of the world never lifted or thinned. The grocery stores ran out of things like fresh bread and milk. No out-of-town mail or newspapers or magazines showed up in New Zebedee. The television sets transmitted only static and snow, and the radios only picked up the New Zebedee station. Yet to Lewis, the scariest part was no adult seemed to notice or care. Almost every family in town had someone involved in the opera, and all those families had become distracted and enchanted by the rehearsals. The opera would run about an hour and a half when it was all put together. Mrs. Pottinger told Rosarita, but until the opening night, the cast was rehearsing only half-hour segments at a time. New Zebedee was holding its breath, and even the people who were not involved with the opera were expecting it to mean great things for the town. That included Rosarita's father. He grumbled a little about how everything had come to a stop in town while the opera was being rehearsed. Still, he wound up saying, well, it'll be good for the place to have a little life in it, I suppose. Rosarita didn't have the heart to argue with him. She and Lewis saw a lot of each other because the schools were not in session. Many of the teachers were in the opera, and Vanderhelm insisted that everyone in the cast rehearse for hours each day from late morning into the night. Most of the kids took advantage of their unexpected break. But Lewis and Rosarita moped around trying to think of something new that might stop Vanderhelm's scheme. We should be able to come up with something, groaned Rosarita one afternoon. She and Lewis were in Jonathan's study again. I mean, this isn't the first time you had to fight an evil spell. Lewis shuddered at the memory that Rosarita's words awakened. Years ago, when he first came to live with Uncle Jonathan, this very house had a dangerous magical item hidden inside it, a doomsday clock. The wicked sorcerer Isaac Izzard had placed it there, and the ghost of Izzard's wife had almost succeeded in activating it. Rosarita had heard Lewis tell about the adventure, and about how Uncle Jonathan, Mrs. Zimmerman, and he had narrowly averted the end of the world. Things had changed since then. He was older and more cautious about meddling with forces he did not understand. The house itself had been altered. Uncle Jonathan had ripped out all the old wallpaper, which had Isaac Izzard's initials in it, and had replaced it with a more cheerful pattern. He had even exorcised the house of all evil influences. However, Harry Vanderhelm seemed to be at least as great a threat as the Izzards had been, and more important, this time Lewis and Rosarita were alone, without the help of the good magicians. Lewis said so, and Rosarita sighed. Maybe he overlooked one, she said. Lewis scowled at her. We tried every telephone number, he reminded her. None of them is working. And every address we tried is a vacant lot, remember? I know, said Rosarita. She pushed her black-rimmed glasses up to her nose and frowned. Maybe there must be something old Vanderhelm forgot. He can't be everywhere at once. Maybe the fog doesn't go very high in the air. I wonder if you could fly out of New Zebedee. Oh, sure, replied Lewis in a mocking voice. I'll just tie on my cape and flap my arms and leap over the fog in a single bound, like Superman. Rosarita gave him a nasty look. I didn't mean that you personally could fly out, she said. But what about a balloon, maybe, or a carrier pigeon? Where do we get one? Asked Lewis. I guess we might make a kite or something, but there's nowhere in town to buy a helium balloon or a carrier pigeon. Or do you want to try to catch one of the pigeons that roosts in the Civil War monument? No, said Rosarita, because where would he go? Just back to the monument, probably. Carrier pigeons have to be trained. We could make a kite. So what? Even if we got it out past the fog, it would probably just crash into a tree or something, and no one would pay attention to it. I wish there was a magician left in town. There's no use wishing for that, grumped Lewis. Vanderhelm took care of every one of them. Suddenly, Rosarita sat up straighter in the chair. Hold on. What about Mildred Who's-this? Huh? Asked Lewis. I don't know what you're talking about. Mildred somebody or other, insisted Rosarita. Mrs. Zimmerman was talking about her, remember? The one that couldn't get her spells to work out right? What was her name? Lewis had been sitting at Uncle Jonathan's desk, slumped forward. He straightened up, too. Right, he said. It was a funny name. Not Johnson or Jackson. It started with a J, though. Jaeger. That was it. Mildred Jaeger. Rosarita jumped up and grabbed the address book on the desk. She flipped through it hurriedly. She isn't here, Rosarita announced. So she isn't a member of the Magician Society. Lewis dug out the skinny New Zebedee telephone book and turned to the J's. Here she is, Mildred Sherman Jaeger. She lives over on Marshall Street. He reached for the phone, and when the operator came on the line, he asked for Mildred Jaeger's number. Lewis held his breath. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" said a friendly voice. It was a friendly voice, an elderly voice. Hello, Mrs. Jaeger," Lewis stammered. "Yes, who is calling, please?" Lewis clamped his hand over the receiver and looked at Rosrita. "What do I tell her?" he whispered. "Tell her who you are," Rosrita shot back. "Ask her if we can come and see her." Mrs. Jaeger, you don't know me, but my name is Louis Barnevelt. My uncle is Jonathan Barnevelt." "Oh, dear me, yes," said the cheerful voice. "Dear Jonathan, such a thoughtful man. How is he?" "He's not in town right now," replied Louis. "Do you remember Lucius Mickleberry?" "Oh, of course. I knew him quite well when he lived in New Zebedee." Hurriedly, Louis told Mrs. Jaeger about the mission his uncle had undertaken. Then he said, "Mrs. Jaeger, have you noticed something odd about the town lately?" "It has been very quiet," admitted Mrs. Jaeger. "Well, we think that something terrible is going on, and we need to talk to someone who knows about—" Louis dropped his voice almost to a whisper. "Magic." There was such a long pause that Louis was afraid the woman had hung up. Finally, she said, "Dear, I wish I could help, but perhaps you should get in touch with some other people. There is a magician society in town." "We can't talk to them," said Louis, and in a rush he explained why. After another long silence, Mrs. Jaeger said, "I think perhaps you had better come over, dear. I don't know what I can do, but I'll help in any way I can. Do you know how to get to my house?" She gave him directions. Louis said goodbye to her, and he and Rosrita ran out to their bikes. It was a day of pale, watery sunlight, with everything looking cold and dead, and the air seemed stagnant and lifeless as they pedaled toward Marshall Street. Mrs. Jaeger's house was a one-story cottage on a block of modest little homes. Rosrita and Louis climbed off their bikes and rang the doorbell, and Louis nervously scraped his shoes on the welcome mat as they waited for someone to answer the door. After a moment, the door swung open, and they found themselves facing a short, plump, gray-haired woman. Her hair was in a bun, and she was wearing a blue dress and a frilly white apron. Her blue eyes looked huge behind gold-rimmed spectacles. Come in," she said, waving the two friends inside. "I was just making some lunch. Do you care for chicken soup? It's homemade, and I have some lovely fresh bread I just baked this morning." Louis was ravenous, and Rosrita said she was hungry, too. Mrs. Jaeger refused to hear a word of their story until they each had a generous bowl of hot, delicious soup, with toasted homemade bread and steaming cups of cocoa. The meal warmed Louis and made him feel more like his normal self than he had in a while. Mrs. Holtz had almost stopped cooking anything except canned goods, and Louis missed her hearty meals. "Now," said Mrs. Jaeger, "tell me about this trouble." She listened while Louis told her about Vanderhelm and the opera, with Rosrita adding facts here and there. When Louis forgot something important, Mrs. Jaeger's magnified eyes grew rounder and more solemn, and she shook her head dolefully. My, she said when Louis and Rosrita had finished. "This is very bad, much worse than I thought. I should have noticed all this myself, but I never listened to the radio, and I don't subscribe to any out-of-town newspapers. Still, the air has been full of bad feelings. I just put it down to growing old and arthritic." "Can you help us?" asked Rosrita. Mrs. Jaeger bit her lip. "I don't know, dear. Of course, I do remember old Vanderhelm. I was just a young woman then, but I was still trying to become a member of the Magician Society. I'm afraid I wasn't much good as a sorceress. Since then, I've learned that I am very good at making cherry preserves and stitching quilts and cooking. I believe you should always do what you are best at, and so I've given up magic." "Tell us about old Vanderhelm," said Louis. "We don't know anything about what he was up to or how the Magician Society defeated him." "Well, I'm not sure I know much about that myself, dear." Mrs. Jaeger sipped her cocoa. "I remember this much. Mr. Vanderhelm's spell was a terribly hard and complex one. It was so powerful that one person could not speak it alone. That's why he wrote the opera. If all the actors sang the lyrics in the right order, then the opera itself becomes his spell. With so many voices, it would work. What would it do?" asked Rosrita. Mrs. Jaeger sighed. "I don't want to frighten you children." "Don't worry about that," Louis assured her. "We're plenty scared already." "Well," the woman's face looked troubled at last, though she said, "as I understood it, the spell would awaken all the dead sorcerers from the past. Their spirits would come in answer to the summons, and Vanderhelm would enable them to possess the bodies of the living. Then they would be his slaves. He would be the king of the dead, with an army of incredibly potent magicians to do his bidding. With that kind of power, it would be a simple thing for him to take over the whole world. He would be the dictator of the entire human race. Lewis shook, remembering Henry Vanderhelm's cunning voice and oily manner. A world ruled by such a person would not be a pleasant place. Roswitha said, "Is that all?" "I'm afraid not," said Mrs. Jaeger. "With the power the spell would give him, Vanderhelm could also command the ordinary unmagical dead. Their bodies would rise from their tombs and march to his orders. He would have a whole army of the dead to do his bidding, and the dead greatly outnumber the living. If anyone dared to oppose him, Vanderhelm would simply have that person killed, and in death, the person would become just another one of Vanderhelm's servants." "That's awful," said Roswitha, her voice trembling. "Is there anything anyone can do?" "Well, there are some safeguards," said Mrs. Jaeger. "The spell will not work if anyone has shed blood, for example. So Vanderhelm could not just kill anyone who tried to oppose him. Of course, after the spell is complete, he can kill whoever he wants. But bad magic can always be counteracted with good. That is how the Magician Society defeated him. They put together a spell of their own that protected them and prevented him from enchanting all the people in town. Then Lucius Mickleberry confronted him in a duel and defeated him. You see, bad magic seldom has many friends to help. A bad magician seldom has many friends to help him with his or her evil spells, and there is strength in numbers." "That might have worked back in 1919, but what can we do?" asked Lewis. "Somehow or other, Henry Vanderhelm has put a spell on all the magicians in New Zebedee except you. We can't act together with all of them because they're all missing. Can you fight him?" Mrs. Jaeger sighed deeply. "Oh, I wasn't any good as a magician," she said in a small voice. "I tried and tried, but every spell I cast went wrong or backfired. Oh, Lewis, I'm sure your uncle or maybe Florence Zimmerman could fight this new Vanderhelm, but I am rusty and out of practice and not very talented besides." "Then it's hopeless?" asked Roswitha. "Of course not," returned Mrs. Jaeger in a brisk voice. "That's nonsense. Nothing is ever hopeless. We will simply have to put our heads together and come up with something that might help us. I only wish," she added regretfully, "that I had some idea of what that might be." And that's the end of chapter 9.